The forge's unexpected guest, the mountain forge. The hammer struck hot iron with rhythmic precision, sending sparks dancing through the dim interior of the forge. 72-year-old Tobias Ironwood had been working metal for over 5 decades, and his weathered hands moved with the practiced ease of a master craftsman. His small forge sat nestled high in the Crimson Ridge Mountains, far from the bustling towns below where most people lived their lives without ever glimpsing the wild beauty of these ancient peaks. Tobias wiped sweat from his brow with a soot-stained cloth, his silver beard catching the orange glow of the furnace. His back ached from years of bending over anvils, and his knees protested every morning when he rose from his simple cot in the room above the workshop. But he wouldn't trade this life for anything. Up here, surrounded by stone and sky, he found a peace that had eluded him during his younger years working in the royal forges of Thornhaven City. The old blacksmith had moved to these mountains 20 years ago after his wife passed, seeking solitude and the honest work of creating tools for the scattered mountain villages. He crafted horseshoes, cooking pots, farming implements, and occasionally a fine blade for travelers who could afford such luxuries. His reputation for quality work had spread through the region, bringing just enough business to keep him comfortable without overwhelming his aging body. Strange sounds in the night, as twilight settled over the mountains. Tobias was banking the forge fire for the evening when he heard something that made his blood run cold. A high-pitched shriek echoed through the valleys, unlike any animal cry he had encountered in 2 decades of mountain living. It came again, this time joined by a second voice creating a desperate harmony of pain and fear. Tobias grabbed his heavy walking stick and a lantern, his instincts overriding the common sense that told him to stay inside after dark. Something was suffering out there, and despite his preference for solitude, he had never been able to ignore a creature in distress. His late wife used to tease him about bringing home injured rabbits and birds, nursing them back to health in their small cottage. The cries led him along a narrow, rocky path behind his forge, where the mountain slope dropped away sharply into a ravine filled with twisted pines. His lantern light caught something metallic glinting between 2 boulders, and as he drew closer, Tobias saw the cruel teeth of a spring trap, the kind used by poachers who cared nothing for the suffering of their prey. What he found made him stop in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. 2 small creatures were caught in a nightmare of metal and pain. They were unlike anything from the natural world, covered in scales that shimmered with iridescent blues and greens even in the dim lantern light. Small wings, delicate as autumn leaves, protruded from their shoulders, and their eyes glowed with an intelligence that sent chills down Tobias's spine. Dragons. Impossible. Legendary, extinct for centuries according to every scholar and historian, yet here they were. 2 hatchlings no bigger than hunting dogs, trapped and bleeding. The rescue, the larger of the 2 hatchlings, hissed at Tobias's approach, trying to position itself protectively in front of its companion. Despite the cruel trap clamped around its foreleg, the smaller one lay still, its breathing shallow with another trap locked around its neck like a terrible collar. Both were covered in scratches and burns, evidence of a desperate attempt to escape. Tobias set down his lantern and spoke in the same calm voice he used with frightened horses. His hands, scarred from years of forge work, moved slowly as he examined the traps. They were professionally made, designed to capture without killing. Someone wanted these creatures alive, which meant the poachers might return. Working quickly but carefully, Tobias used his knowledge of metalwork to find the weak points in each trap mechanism. The larger hatchling snapped at him once, its small teeth catching his sleeve, but Tobias simply continued his soothing murmur of reassurance. When the first trap released, the hatchling stumbled free, immediately moving to its companion's side. The second trap was more complex, its spring mechanism rusted and jammed. Tobias had to use a small file from his belt pouch, working by feel as much as sight in the dim light. The smaller hatchling whimpered, a sound so heartbreaking that Tobias felt tears prick his eyes. Finally, with a metallic snap, the trap opened. Tobias carefully gathered both hatchlings into his thick leather apron, cradling them against his chest as he made his way back to the forge. They were surprisingly light, their bodies radiating a warmth that had nothing to do with his body heat. The smaller one had lost consciousness, but the larger watched him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes, as if measuring his intentions. Sanctuary and iron and fire inside the forge. Tobias laid the hatchlings on a pile of clean cloth near the cooling furnace. By better light, he could see the extent of their injuries. Deep lacerations marked where the traps had bitten into scales and flesh, and both showed signs of exposure and exhaustion. The smaller one's breathing remained worryingly shallow. Tobias had tended many wounds over the years, both human and animal. He cleaned their injuries with warm water and applied a salve made from mountain herbs, working with the gentle precision that had made him a master at his craft. The larger hatchling allowed his ministrations, though it never stopped watching him, ready to defend its companion at any sign of threat. As he worked, Tobias noticed strange markings on their scales, patterns that seemed to shift in the firelight. The larger one had swirling designs like smoke, while the smaller bore patterns reminiscent of falling embers. Without thinking too deeply about it, he began calling them by those images. Cinder for the larger, protective one, and ash for the smaller, frailer hatchling. He offered them water from a shallow bowl, and Cinder drank eagerly before using its snout to nudge Ash awake. The smaller hatchling's eyes opened, dull with pain and fever, but it managed a few laps of water before collapsing again. Tobias prepared a nest of blankets in the corner of his workshop, away from the drafts but close enough to the residual heat of the forge. He carried both hatchlings to this makeshift bed, noting how Cinder immediately curled around Ash, wings spreading slightly to provide warmth and protection. Danger returns. Tobias had just settled into his chair with a cup of bitter tea when he heard horses approaching up the mountain path. Few people traveled at night, and those who did usually had reasons to avoid daylight. He moved to the window and saw 3 riders, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats, leading a pack horse loaded with cages and equipment. Poachers, the kind of men who would set cruel traps for legendary creatures and sell them to the highest bidder. Tobias's jaw tightened, his weathered face hardening into an expression his old military comrades would have recognized. He might be an old man now, but he had fought in the border wars 40 years ago, and some skills never faded. He quickly covered the sleeping hatchlings with a tarp, hiding them behind barrels of iron ore. Then he stepped outside, his walking stick in hand, to meet the visitors with a calm he didn't entirely feel. The lead rider was a lean man with a scar across his cheek and eyes like flint. He dismounted with casual arrogance, his companions remaining on their horses, hands resting near the weapons at their belts. "Evening, old-timer," the scarred man said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of someone used to intimidation. "We're tracking some valuable property. Small-scaled, probably injured. You wouldn't have seen anything unusual around here?" Tobias leaned on his stick, playing up his age and frailty. "Just the usual mountain creatures. Deer, rabbits, the occasional bear. What exactly are you hunting?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Private collectors pay good money for exotic specimens." "Very good money. We've tracked our quarry to this area, and we don't intend to leave empty-handed." "Well, you're welcome to search the area," Tobias said mildly, "but I haven't seen anything unusual. Just an old man working his forge." The scarred man studied him for a long moment, suspicion clear in his expression. Finally, he nodded. "We'll be camping nearby tonight. If you do happen to see something, there's a reward. A substantial one." He tossed a leather purse that clinked with coins at Tobias's feet. "That's just a taste of what we're willing to pay." Tobias didn't pick up the purse. "I'll keep my eyes open." After the poachers rode off into the darkness, Tobias stood outside for several minutes, listening to the mountain silence. Then he went back inside, locked and barred his door, and checked on the sleeping hatchlings. Cinder's eyes opened at his approach, glowing softly in the darkness. "Don't worry," Tobias whispered, his old hands gentle as he adjusted their blankets. "I didn't spend 50 years working iron just to let scum like that take you." He settled back into his chair, his walking stick across his knees, and kept watch through the night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, these 2 small lives were under his protection, and Tobias Ironwood had never failed to protect something placed in his care. The Dragon Queen's arrival. Dawn of reckoning. The first light of dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold as Tobias stirred from his chair. His neck protested the uncomfortable sleeping position, but he had maintained his vigil through the night. The hatchlings were still sleeping, their breathing more steady and regular than the previous evening. Ash's fever seemed to have broken, and even in sleep Cinder maintained that protective curl around its smaller companion. Tobias rose quietly, stretching his stiff joints before stoking the forge back to life. He needed to maintain the appearance of normalcy in case the poachers were watching. As flames licked up around the coal, he heard a soft chirping sound. Both hatchlings were awake, their luminous eyes fixed on him with what looked almost like gratitude. He prepared a simple breakfast of dried meat and bread, surprised when both hatchlings showed interest in the food. Cinder took pieces delicately from his fingers while Ash needed help, too weak to eat independently. Tobias hand-fed the smaller one with the patience of someone who had once raised orphaned lambs on his family's farm decades ago. As the sun climbed higher, Tobias noticed something remarkable. Ash's wounds were healing at an extraordinary rate. Where deep lacerations had marked the delicate scales yesterday, now only pink lines remained. Even Cinder's injuries showed dramatic improvement. Whatever these creatures were, they possessed healing abilities far beyond normal animals. The sky darkens. Around mid-morning, the temperature suddenly dropped. Tobias looked up from repairing a broken plow blade to see dark clouds rolling over the mountain peaks with unnatural speed. The sky turned the color of bruised plums, and a strange pressure filled the air, making his ears pop as if he were ascending rapidly to a higher altitude. The hatchlings became agitated, chirping urgently and moving toward the forge entrance despite their injuries. Cinder spread its wings, which were already noticeably larger than yesterday, and released a sound that was half cry, half song. Ash joined in, their voices creating a harmony that made the iron tools around the forge vibrate in resonance. Then Tobias heard it, a sound like distant thunder but rhythmic, purposeful, the beating of enormous wings. His heart hammered against his ribs as he moved to the doorway, the hatchlings pressing against his legs as if seeking protection, even as they called out in excitement. What descended from the storm clouds defied all earthly measure. A dragon of such magnificent size that Tobias's forge looked like a child's toy house by comparison. Her scales were deep as sapphire, edged with silver that caught the strange stormlight. She was easily 50 feet from snout to tail, with wings that could have sheltered his entire workshop. Horns crowned her head like a warrior queen's diadem, and her eyes blazed with ancient fire and fierce intelligence. The dragon landed with surprising grace in the clearing before the forge, her massive talons sinking into the rocky ground. The force of her wing beats had scattered tools across Tobias's yard and sent dust swirling in miniature cyclones. But what truly terrified and awed him was the intelligence in those eyes. This was no mere beast. This was a being of thought, purpose, and power beyond human comprehension. Face to face with majesty, Tobias Ironwood had faced charging cavalry lines in the border wars. He had stood firm when enemy soldiers breached the gates of Fortress Ashmont. But nothing in his 72 years had prepared him for this moment. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to prostrate himself before this ancient power. Instead, he stepped forward, placing himself between the dragon and her young. The great dragon's eyes fixed on him, and Tobias felt something brush against his mind. Not words exactly, but images and emotions that formed understanding more direct than speech. She was searching his memories, seeing the rescue, the healing, the protection he had offered her offspring. To his amazement, Tobias found he could push back gently, sharing his own images more deliberately. He showed her the traps, the poachers, his decision to shelter the hatchlings despite the danger. He tried to convey his wonder at their existence, his determination to keep them safe. The dragon's massive head lowered until one enormous eye was level with Tobias. He could see his reflection in that eye, a tiny old man facing something from myth and legend. Then, wonder of wonders, he felt something that could only be described as approval, even respect. A voice filled his mind, feminine and powerful, carrying the weight of centuries. Human called Tobias Ironwood. You have shown courage and kindness to my children when you could have profited from their capture or fled from danger. Tobias found his voice, though it came out rough with emotion. They needed help. Any decent person would have done the same. A sound like rumbling earth emanated from the dragon's chest. Laughter, Tobias realized with wonder. She was laughing. You would be surprised how rarely your kind lives up to such ideals. I am Embera, Queen of the Mountain Wing, guardian of the high places. My children are Cinder and Ash, and I have been searching for them since hunters drove us from our sanctuary 2 days past. The hatchlings rushed forward, their excited chirps filling the air as they greeted their mother. Embera's fierce expression softened as she nuzzled them gently, her massive snout carefully examining their healing wounds. Tobias watched the reunion with a lump in his throat, remembering his own children, grown and scattered to distant cities, whom he rarely saw. The offer after several minutes of reunion, Embera returned her attention to Tobias. The poachers you encountered are part of a larger group. They serve a collector in the southern kingdoms who pays fortunes for rare creatures. They will not stop hunting my kind until they are captured or driven away. Tobias nodded grimly. I suspected as much. They seem too organized, too well-equipped to be ordinary poachers. You are in danger now, Tobias Ironwood. They will suspect you harbor my young. When they return, and they will return, they will not leave without searching thoroughly. Let them come, Tobias said, his jaw setting stubbornly. I didn't protect your children just to hand them over at the first sign of trouble. Embera regarded him with those ancient eyes, and Tobias felt another brush against his mind, deeper this time. She was seeing not just his recent actions but the shape of his entire life, his years as a soldier, his decades as a craftsman, his grief at losing his beloved wife, his quiet contentment in these mountains. She saw his loneliness, his unspoken wish for purpose beyond mere survival. You are rare among your kind, old one. Your heart burns with a fire that is not dimmed despite the years and sorrows you have carried. Embera straightened to her full height, her wings spreading wide. For protecting my children, for showing compassion without thought of reward, I offer you a gift that has not been given to a human in 300 years. The dragon opened her mouth, and instead of flame, a sphere of pure light emerged. It hovered in the air before Tobias, pulsing with inner fire that shifted through every color imaginable. Within the light he could see a crystalline structure, geometric and perfect, containing what looked like a miniature sun. This is Dragon's heart fire, Embera explained. A flame that never dies, never consumes, but gives only warmth and light. It is forged from the core of dragon magic, and it will transform your forge into something beyond mortal making. Metal worked in this fire will hold properties no ordinary smithing can achieve. Blades that never dull, armor that turns aside any blow, tools that work with preternatural efficiency. Tobias stared at the floating crystal, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. Your Majesty, I am honored, but I am just an old blacksmith. Such power, such responsibility. That is precisely why you are worthy, Embera interrupted gently. You do not seek power. You seek only to live quietly and help where you can. Such humans are rarer than dragon fire itself. The crystal drifted closer to Tobias, its warmth pleasant against his weathered face. He reached out slowly, his scarred hands closing around it. The crystal was warm but not burning, solid but somehow alive with energy. As his fingers touched it, he felt something flow into him, an understanding of how to use this gift, how to integrate it with his forge. Flames of destiny, Tobias carried the crystal to his forge and placed it carefully in the heart of his furnace. The moment it settled among the coals, the entire structure blazed with new life. Flames erupted in a rainbow cascade, not consuming the fuel but transforming it. The heat was different, intense but controlled, responding to Tobias's thoughts as much as to physical fuel. He felt the forge become an extension of himself, understood instinctively how to shape this magical fire. A piece of ordinary iron resting near the furnace began to glow, not with normal red heat but with a silver-blue radiance. Tobias picked up his hammer, and when he struck the glowing metal, the sound rang out like a bell, pure and clear. The metal moved under his hammer as if eager to take shape, flowing like water but holding its form with perfect precision. Tobias found himself working with a skill beyond his considerable experience, the dragon fire guiding his hands, teaching him techniques that human smiths had never imagined. Embera watched from the doorway, too large to enter but able to observe clearly. You understand now? This fire will serve you faithfully, but it carries responsibility. What you create must serve good purposes. The flame knows intent, and it will resist being used for evil. Tobias nodded, setting down his hammer as the iron cooled into a blade of extraordinary beauty. Even unfinished and unpolished, it gleamed with inner light. I understand, Your Majesty, and I swear on my wife's memory that I will use this gift honorably. The poachers return. Their moment of peace shattered as harsh voices echoed up the mountain path. The poachers had returned, and this time they had brought reinforcements. Tobias counted at least 8 riders, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of men who made their living through violence. The scarred leader from the previous night rode at the front, his face twisted with anger. Old man, we know you're hiding them. Our tracking spells led us straight here. Hand over the dragons and maybe we'll let you live. Tobias stepped out of his forge, his walking stick in hand, but he no longer felt like a frail old man. The dragon fire within his forge had awakened something in him, a vitality he thought long lost to age. "You're trespassing on my property. Leave now and I'll overlook this discourtesy." The leader laughed, a cruel sound. Brave words from a man who should know better. "Boys, search the place. Tear it apart if you have to." As the poachers dismounted, Embera emerged from where she had been waiting beside the forge. Her appearance sent the horses into a panic, throwing several riders. The men stumbled backward, weapons drawn but hands shaking, faced with a creature from their darkest legends. "You dare hunt my children?" Embera's mental voice was so powerful that all the poachers grabbed their heads in pain. "You dare threaten one who has shown them kindness?" The scarred leader tried to rally his men. "There's only one dragon. We have crossbows, nets, and binding chains. She's worth a fortune." But before they could act, Tobias stepped forward and his hands were no longer empty. He held the blade he had just forged, still glowing with dragon fire. When he raised it, the weapon blazed with light that made the poachers shield their eyes. "You've made a mistake coming here," Tobias said, his voice carrying strength that belied his age. "This mountain is under protection now, the Dragon Queen's protection and mine. What happened next would be told in mountain villages for generations." Embera released a torrent of flame that formed a wall between the poachers and her children, while Tobias moved with speed and skill that shouldn't have been possible for a man his age. The dragon fire had restored something in him, not youth exactly, but vitality and purpose. The poachers fled, those who could still run, abandoning their equipment and their wounded. The scarred leader screamed threats about return and revenge, but Embera's roar sent him scrambling faster than his companions. When silence returned to the mountain clearing, Tobias lowered his blade and looked at his hands in wonder. He felt strong, purposeful, needed in a way he hadn't since his wife's passing. Embera approached him, lowering her great head. "You have proven yourself, Tobias Ironwood. The fire recognizes your heart. Use it well, and know that you have the friendship of dragons. We will watch over you as you have watched over ours." The gift of eternal flame. A new dawn. 3 days had passed since the poachers' defeat, and Tobias Ironwood's forge had become something extraordinary. The dragon's heart fire burned perpetually in his furnace, casting its rainbow radiance across tools and metal that now seemed eager to serve his hands. Word had spread through the mountain communities about the old blacksmith's miraculous new abilities, though no one knew the true source of his transformation. Tobias stood at his anvil, working on a commission from the village of Red Pine, 12 miles down the mountain. The farmer who had ordered a new plow blade would be astonished when he discovered the tool would never dull, would cut through rocky soil like butter, and would somehow make his fields more fertile. The dragon fire infused every creation with subtle magic that served good purposes. Cinder and ash had remained at the forge, recovering fully under Embera's watchful care. The hatchlings had grown noticeably in just 3 days, now the size of large sheep rather than dogs. They spent their days exploring the mountain slopes under their mother's supervision, but each evening they returned to curl up near Tobias's furnace, drawn to the warmth of the dragon fire that had become part of his forge. Embera herself had made a home in a cave system 1/2 mile up the mountain, close enough to watch over her young but far enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention. She visited the forge daily, and Tobias had grown to cherish their conversations, both spoken and mental. She shared stories of dragon history, of the days when her kind flew openly across the world before humans grew numerous and fearful. "We retreated to hidden sanctuaries," Embera explained one evening as they watched the sunset paint the peaks in gold and crimson. "Not from fear of humans, but from sorrow. Your kind grew powerful and numerous, and in your fear, you hunted what you did not understand. Rather than war with you, we chose to fade from memory, to become legends rather than remain targets." Tobias listened, his old heart heavy with the weight of that history. "I'm sorry for what my kind has done. The fear and hatred that drove dragons into hiding. Do not carry guilt for actions not your own," Embera said gently. "Every race has its noble souls and its cruel ones. You have shown me that good humans still exist, those who choose compassion over profit, courage over safety. That is why I gave you the heart fire, not just as reward but as hope." The collector's arrival on the 4th morning, a fine carriage pulled by 4 white horses labored up the mountain road toward Tobias's forge. It was an incongruous sight. Such luxury in this rugged landscape. The carriage bore no family crest, but everything about it screamed wealth and power. Tobias set down his hammer and wiped his hands, a sense of unease settling over him. The carriage door opened, and a man stepped out who looked completely out of place in the mountain wilderness. He wore expensive silk robes in deep purple, his fingers glittering with jeweled rings. His face was soft and pampered, his eyes sharp with intelligence and something else, obsessive hunger. Master Ironwood, I presume? The man's voice was cultured, educated, but carried an undertone that made Tobias's skin crawl. I am Lord Cassius Brokenthrall, collector of rare and extraordinary items. I have traveled far to speak with you about a matter of mutual interest. I'm just a blacksmith, Tobias replied carefully. I don't have much that would interest a lord. Cassius smiled, but it was the smile of a snake eyeing prey. Oh, but you do. You see, I employ certain individuals to acquire specimens for my private menagerie, creatures of myth and legend that most believe extinct. My men reported an encounter here several days ago. An encounter involving dragons. Tobias kept his expression neutral. Your men were trespassing and were driven off. That's the end of it. Hardly, Cassius said, his smile widening. You see, I am willing to pay extraordinary sums for those hatchlings. Name your price, Master Ironwood. Gold, property, titles, I have the means to provide whatever your heart desires. They're not for sale. They're not mine to sell. Cassius's smile faded, replaced by cold calculation. Then perhaps we discuss the adult dragon I'm told made an appearance. A fully grown specimen would be worth more than this entire mountain. I could make you wealthier than any king. Not interested, Tobias said flatly. Now leave my property before I make you leave. The collector laughed, a sound without warmth. An old man threatens me? How amusing. You should know that I always acquire what I want, Master Ironwood. Always. If gold won't persuade you, perhaps other methods will prove more effective. From the forest surrounding the forge, armed men emerged. Dozens of them, professional soldiers by the look of them, wearing light armor and carrying weapons meant for capturing, not killing. Crossbows with nets instead of bolts, weighted ropes, and long poles with loops at the end. You see, Cassius continued pleasantly, I came prepared for multiple outcomes. These men are trained dragon hunters, specialists I've employed from the Far Eastern kingdoms where legends of your kind's magnificent beasts still circulate. They know how to capture even the largest dragons alive and unharmed. My specimens must be perfect after all. Tobias reached for his hammer, but two soldiers had already moved behind him, weapons trained on his back. He was trapped, outnumbered, and despite the vitality the dragon fire had restored to him, he was still one old man against an army, the bond of fire high above the forge. Embera felt Tobias's distress through the connection the dragon fire had created between them. She burst from her cave with a roar that shook snow from the mountain peaks, her wings carrying her to the forge in seconds. Cinder and Ash followed, smaller but fierce in their determination to protect the human who had saved them. The soldiers scattered as Embera landed, but they quickly reformed their lines. These were professionals, not the common poachers who had fled before. They worked in coordinated teams, some drawing Embera's attention while others prepared nets and binding chains. Magnificent, Cassius breathed, his eyes gleaming with avarice. Even more beautiful than I imagined. Oh, she will be the crown jewel of my collection, the envy of every noble in the southern kingdoms. Tobias wrenched free from the soldiers holding him and ran toward his forge. The dragon fire blazed higher as he approached, responding to his need. He thrust his hands into the flames, and instead of burning, he felt power flow into him. The fire wrapped around his arms like liquid light, then spread across his body in an armor of dancing flame. The soldiers nearest him backed away in shock as Tobias emerged from the forge transformed. He held no weapon, but the dragon fire answered his thoughts, extending from his hands in whips of controlled flame. When the first soldier tried to net, Embera, Tobias's fire whip, cut through the net like gossamer, then disarmed the man without harming him. You don't understand, Tobias called out to the soldiers, his voice amplified by the dragon fire's magic. I'm not your enemy, and neither are they. You're following a man who sees living beings as property, who would cage majesty for his own glory. Is that really who you want to serve? Some soldiers hesitated, uncertainty crossing their faces, but Cassius screamed orders, promising double pay, threatening dismissal and worse. The professionals continued their assault, and Embera found herself entangled in specially designed chains that glowed with enchantments meant to suppress her magic. Cinder and Ash attacked the soldiers surrounding their mother, breathing small gouts of flame and slashing with their growing claws. But they were still young, still learning their strength, and the experienced hunters worked around them, driving them away from Embera with long poles and loud noises. Tobias felt desperation rising in his chest. The dragon fire gave him power, but he was one man against dozens. Even with the gift Embera had given him, he couldn't protect her and her young against such numbers. He needed something more, some way to turn this tide. Then he remembered Embera's words. The flame knows intent, and it will resist being used for evil. Tobias stopped fighting the soldiers directly. Instead, he spread his arms wide and opened himself completely to the dragon fire. He let it see, his heart, his intentions, his desperate need not for power but for protection. He showed the fire what was at stake, the noble creatures who would spend their lives in cages if Cassius succeeded. The dragon's heart fire responded with a fury that shook the foundations of the forge. It erupted from the furnace in a column of rainbow flame that split into dozens of threads, each one seeking out a soldier and wrapping around their weapons without burning flesh. Crossbows melted, chains shattered, nets dissolved into ash. Within seconds, Cassius's small army stood disarmed and unharmed, but completely helpless. The fire threads then turned to the enchanted chains binding Embera. These were harder to break, crafted with old magic specifically designed to hold dragons. But the heart fire was older still, forged from dragon essence itself. The chains cracked, then exploded into harmless sparks. Justice and Mercy Embera rose to her full height, free once more, and fixed Cassius with a gaze that made the collector fall to his knees. You would cage me? You would take my children and make them perform for your entertainment? Cassius tried to speak, to bargain or threaten, but found his voice had fled before the terrible majesty of an angry dragon queen. Embera's mind voice filled everyone's consciousness, forcing them to feel what captive creatures felt. The misery, the loss of purpose, the slow death of spirit that came from being treated as property. The soldiers dropped their weapons and fled, many weeping at the emotions they had experienced. They would return to their villages and never again raise arms against innocent creatures. The lesson had been seared into their souls. Only Cassius remained still on his knees, tears streaming down his pampered face as he experienced the suffering he had caused countless creatures over his years of collecting. Embera could have killed him with a thought, but instead, she showed him something else. The joy of free creatures, the beauty of living things in their natural state, the profound satisfaction that came from protecting rather than possessing. When she released him from the mental contact, Cassius looked like a different man. The hunger in his eyes had been replaced by horror at his own actions. What have I done? He whispered. What have I become? Tobias approached the broken collector, the dragonfire still wreathing his form but gentle now, not threatening. You can change, Tobias said quietly. You have wealth and influence. Use them to protect creatures instead of collecting them. Open your menagerie's cages. Let the creatures you've imprisoned return to their homes. Make amends while you still can. Cassius looked up at the old blacksmith wreathed in magic fire and the dragon queen standing behind him. He saw not conquerors but teachers, offering him redemption instead of revenge. I will, he vowed, his voice breaking. I swear on everything I am. I will make this right. The new Guardian's weeks passed. Cassius proved true to his word. Messages arrived at the forge detailing the release of dozens of rare creatures from his collection, each returned to their proper habitats. The collector had become a protector, using his resources to establish sanctuaries and fight against those who still trafficked in exotic animals. Tobias's forge became legendary throughout the region. People traveled from distant kingdoms seeking tools and weapons crafted in the dragonfire, willing to wait months for the privilege. But Tobias remained selective, accepting only commissions that served good purposes. Farming tools that increased yields, medical instruments that helped healers save lives, protective armor for those who defended the innocent. Cinder and Ash grew into magnificent adolescent dragons, their colors deepening and their abilities strengthening each day. They often helped Tobias in the forge, their natural fire combining with the heart fire to create works of even greater magic. The bond between the old blacksmith and the young dragons became a thing of legend, proof that different kinds of beings could work together in harmony. Embera remained in the mountains, her cave system expanding into a proper home. Other dragons began appearing, drawn by the safety she had established and the presence of the heart fire. The Crimson Ridge Mountains became a sanctuary, protected by dragon magic and the reputation of the old blacksmith, who had stood against an army to protect his friends. On quiet evenings, Tobias would sit outside his forge and watch the dragons dance through the sky at sunset, their scales catching the dying light in spectacular displays of color. His body had aged beyond the vigor the dragon fire first restored, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. He had found purpose in his final years, had become part of something larger than himself. One such evening, as Embera landed beside him with her now adult children, she spoke words that brought tears to the old man's eyes. "You gave us safety when we had none, Tobias Ironwood. You gave us hope when humans had taught us only to fear. Your forge will burn with dragon fire long after you rest, a beacon for any who need protection or sanctuary. You have built something that will endure beyond your years." Tobias smiled, his weathered face peaceful. "I just did what needed doing. Any decent person would have done the same." "No," Embera said gently. "Any decent person would have helped us in that moment. But you did more. You changed the world, one act of kindness at a time. That is the true magic, stronger than any fire I could give you. The magic of a good heart that never stops caring." As stars emerged in the darkening sky, Tobias Ironwood sat surrounded by dragons, his forge fire burning eternal behind him, a gift that would protect and serve long after his story ended. He had come to these mountains seeking solitude and found instead a family, a purpose and a legacy that would inspire generations to come. The dragon's heart fire burned on, eternal and bright, a symbol of the bond between an old blacksmith and a dragon queen, between courage and compassion, between two unlikely friends who had changed each other's world through simple acts of kindness and extraordinary bravery. And in villages throughout the mountains, parents told their children the story of Tobias Ironwood, the blacksmith who befriended dragons and whose forge still burns with magic fire, reminding all who see it that true strength comes not from power but from the courage to protect the helpless and the wisdom to choose kindness over fear.